This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now, back in April, the World Bank warned that global remittances are projected to decline by about 20% this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the forced shutdowns that have driven economies to a standstill to varying degrees around the world. This projected fall would be the sharpest decline in recent history, largely due to a fall in the wages and employment of migrant workers. Remittances to low and middle income countries are projected to fall by 19.7%, and Asia will be disproportionately hit. South Asia will see a 22.1% drop, and East Asia and the Pacific will see a 13% drop. This decline comes after remittances to low and middle income countries like Nepal, like the Philippines, reached a record $554 billion in 2019. Now remember, this was written in April. There is not much more certainty now in August than there was in April. So to discuss the ramifications of this, we have today Kunda Dixit in Kathmandu. Kunda is the editor of Nepali Times, and we have on the line from Bangkok, Aziz Elbehri, Senior Economist and Senior Policy Officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, at its Asia Pacific office there. Good morning to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Morning.
So Kunda, perhaps I can start with you. Now, Nepal is one of the most heavily dependent countries on remittances from migrant labor, sent out to India, to the Gulf and other countries. Is Nepal feeling the impact? Is it tangible of many of these migrant workers basically out of work?
Yes, definitely. And as you mentioned, the Asia average was 20% decline in remittances, but for Nepal it's 28%. And that's because almost a third of the GDP equivalent of this country depends on remittances. So it's really the main source of income for the government for funding its imports. 16% of our imports are petroleum, for example. So we export the sweat of our workers to import the oil from the same countries.
Aziz, in times of recession and in times of disaster, we often see this, and we see as well a reverse flow of migrant labor sometimes back to their places of origin. And this is very often in the rural sectors of their countries of origin. The question is, what lasting effect will this have? Will this increase poverty? Will this test resilience? And does the rural economy offer any potential at all as a safety net, let alone a future? That's a big question, I know, but if you could sort of walk us through that.
We looked at that in terms of the movements of migration as a result of COVID lockdown since March. Basically, we distinguish between reverse migration from urban centers, from services and industry and tourism back into rural villages within countries. We saw that happening in India, in the large scale in India. We saw that happening in Mongolia and in Thailand, where I'm based, and also across countries. So a lot of reverse migration took place, for example, from Thailand into neighboring countries. It's a big challenge right now for governments as they are trying to redesign the recovery programs. It's difficult given that COVID is still with us and we are still under more or less lockdown. But this is an unprecedented kind of development. In terms of implications for rural economies, it goes both ways. We are still assessing the impacts. Basically, we have surplus labor in rural areas right now that governments still have to figure out how to marshal and how to leverage effectively. There are no plans right now, but still, this is where the programming, the reprogramming of policies and investments are taking place with the help of IFIs, international finance institutions, as well as donors, but also within government reprogramming it themselves. It's a moving target. We are still monitoring the situation. We have some anecdotal evidence, but we haven't really gotten a final kind of understanding of what should be done at the micro level.
Kunda, back to you now with a similar question. You know, there's so much talk about resilience. Is there sufficient resilience? Have governments, and specifically in Nepal, which is very vulnerable to climate change, has a massive multiplier effect, and I'd like you to speak to that a bit as well. Has the government there done enough to support the rural economy?
It's precisely because the government has not done enough over the last decades that there has been such a outmigration of subsistence farmers abroad and as well as to the cities. So, up to 15% of Nepal's 30 million people are working abroad at any given time. Now, if it wasn't for COVID, we'd all be talking about climate change and how climate refugees, the fact that monsoons have been erratic, has really affected the rural economy.
And the drop in remittances, will that also affect things like, earthquake preparedness and everything across the board?
Yeah, and Nepal was just recovering from the earthquake in 2015. In fact, yesterday we had another aftershock when this COVID crisis hit. So it's going to be really, really difficult. It was because of remittances that Nepal's poverty rate had halved in the last 20 years. And if the remittances are going to fall by 28%, as the World Bank's predicting, or the ADB actually is predicting, then it's going to be a really serious hit on the economy. And all these people who have come back are going to be without jobs here. They'll be wanting to go back to the Gulf or Malaysia or wherever to work, and yet those jobs will not be available now.
So Aziz, now Asia's agriculture sector more broadly has for a long time been somewhat hollowed out, with the average age of farmers has been growing older. For example, young people want to work in cities, in different industries and so forth. So you find a lot of farms, I've been to in Southeast Asia, only grandparents and grandchildren. The middle generation is sort of missing. And this has kind of happened already in the West some years ago. Now, how important is the farm economy to the question of resilience in times of crisis like this?
Very critical. The resilience of rural economy and farming in general, especially in the context of climate change, but also the fact that this region is extremely prone to all types and frequent catastrophic disasters. One of the characteristics of Asia's farming community is that small-scale farming has persisted over time, despite the economic development that the region has witnessed. And one would expect in a normal development process that farms will tend to be larger and larger. More farmers will migrate out of farming into other sectors of the economy, but hasn't happened. What we see is a persistence of a large number of small-scale farms. A lot of them are doing multiple income or livelihood activities. So farming is partial farming in many cases. Now, with the COVID and the insistence on rebuilding resilience of food systems, because this is one of the consequences of COVID, is that it disrupted the food systems. So we're back to the starting point and trying to re-energize the base, or the upstream side of the food system at the production level. And one of the main, main thrust of these redevelopment thinking is, of course, through innovation technologies, but also a more sustainable use of resources, whether irrigation, water, or other types of resources, and then develop the rural agribusiness at the small scale, which is very, very much needed. So all of these are now being at the forefront of the policy agenda in many countries, in spite of the financial and the fiscal constraints and the squeeze that many of these countries are facing, in part due to the economic downturn, but also due to the loss of these traditional resources like migrant remittances. But rebuilding resilience, even at a small scale for farmers in rural areas, is now on the top of the agenda. It will be difficult, but it is the priority for most countries, including Nepal, but also throughout the region.
But the bottom line, Aziz, is of course that poverty is going to deepen, right?
Clearly, there are already indications that the progress that has been made on many of the SDGs in reducing poverty or reducing malnutrition or reducing food insecurities, unfortunately, are either stagnating or will get worse before they start getting better. We are facing a very tough decade ahead along the 2030 agenda. And now many of these indicators that weren't actually progressing as they should before are now even going back, requiring doubling up the effort, but requiring a new policies, but also new thinking, new governance, and then redirecting the resources and how they have been prioritized in the past. So there's a lot of work to be done at the policy level, across the board, across the region, and specifically within the rural economy, which is now seeing an influx of surplus labor and also difficulties of managing the development from a financial and fiscal side.
I think if I may just add, Aziz mentioned SDGs. Just one statistic. In the last 3 months in Nepal, government figures show that the number of children who died either in hospital or at home is up 30% from the same period last year. So, and this is because the children couldn't get to hospital because of the lockdowns, no transportation. Also, they were fearful that they'd be infected. So we might have been pushed back a decade in terms of child maternal survival and other social aspects. That's
very depressing. Now, given this deepening poverty, Kunda, Nepal has seen quite a lot of turmoil in the last 15 years or so. Is there a heightened risk of social and political tension and unrest going forward? Will this manifest in ways that will shake the country, shake the system?
Yeah, we've had periodic eruptions of street protests that have brought down governments. That has actually, we went from monarchy to republic in 2008 because of this. We went through a 10-year insurgency, also driven by inequality and poverty. But this crisis is completely unprecedented, and I think people are just so busy trying to survive and there's no real organized opposition. There's been a few protests led by youth in Kathmandu, but it hasn't really gathered that critical mass in order to be a threat to the government so far. But let me just also add that not everyone has come back. Okay, we have, let's say, between 2.5 to 3 million Nepalis working in India. Of them, only 200,000 have come back. Of the other 2 million in the Gulf and Malaysia, only 32,000 have come back in the past month or so, and another 150,000 have registered to come back. So there's still a large population of Nepalis out there in those countries, and maybe the host countries also depend on this labor because this is the kind of jobs that their own nationals would not do. So there might actually not be that much of a decline in migration.
But there's a decline in remittances.
But this was even before.
Migrant laborers workers are just sitting around basically in static economies, right?
The decline in remittances and the number of people going abroad, at least for Nepal, was going down anyway for the past 3 years. COVID has just made it slightly worse. And I think a lot of people here are expecting things to pick up, later in the year with people going out. Just like after the earthquake, we expected a lot of people to come back and to rebuild homes, but the fact that the earthquake actually forced more people to go out because they needed to earn money to rebuild their homes. So in a similar way, I think desperation will mean that there'll be a lot of labor who will want to go out again.
And another thing one hears a lot about is the slogan "Build Back Better," and we hear this after every disaster, every recession, and to me, I'm a little cynical about this because after every disaster and recession, we just basically put the same old house of cards back together again.
Yeah.
Is there any sign of anything, any sort of forward thinking, any enlightened moments?
Not from the government in Nepal, at least. But there's anecdotal evidence that the returnees who came back, especially from India and elsewhere, they came back, and this coincided with the paddy planting season. So there's now actually a lot of labor out there in the villages, and land and terraces that had gone fallow because of out-migration. There's now more rice cultivation, and also the monsoon has been very healthy. So there is a bright spot there.
Can I add another?
Aziz, if I may come to you, similarly again, with deepening poverty, do you foresee any possibility of social and political tension going forward across the board? You cover so many countries. Of course, the circumstances are very different in many countries, but do you see that as a risk going forward?
There is a risk, yes. In fact, there is a risk in almost every country, depending on how they handle the COVID crisis and how long it will last. I think the current situation. There are demonstrations already in various cities in terms of reactions to how governments are responding. But so far, we haven't seen the kind of responses or demonstrations or riots that we have seen under the crisis 2007, 2008, the food crisis that led to huge price increases and a lot of political instability across many developing countries. We haven't seen that because of the uniqueness of this pandemic. If I may just add one more bright spot to the story of Nepal on the returnees of labor. Those who have returned, also they are bringing new ideas and new technologies and new fresh perspectives of how to develop the rural economy. So we see, for example, in Nepal, a lot of new types of businesses coming up at the micro level that sort of create the diversification of agriculture, which many rural areas in Nepal so badly need, especially after the 2015 earthquake. So there is a little bit of building back better in the sense of capitalizing from these not only assets they are bringing, but also ideas that could be, if properly leveraged by governments and programs, could revitalize at least various sections of the rural economy, at least in the case of Nepal. In Southeast Asia, where I'm based, the situation is critical in a sense that, as was mentioned, most migrants did not return back to their countries because of restrictions and also because of incentives given by the host countries to keep them in place because they are needed for various activities, including within the rural and the farming sector. So one of the clear lessons that are being drawn by governments is to strengthen the social protection, the social safety net programs, and expand it to the labor, to the migrants, to the rural communities, in order to link the production with these social safety nets, which is going to become one of the major levers of building back better concept that is now being promoted by the UN and by development partners. Over.
Oh. Kunda, over to you in Kathmandu. A last quick word.
Well, I think, as Aziz was saying, there's a lot of good ideas that returnees are bringing back. We have covered it in our paper, anecdotal evidence of someone who came back from Qatar and started a dairy farm because he worked in a dairy farm there. Others who come back from Saudi Arabia and started an ostrich farm, unheard of in Nepal. What the government needs to do is, the government does have a rehabilitation program for returnees, but it's just not getting traction. And this needs to be really spread out and really use this, the returnee population and the knowledge and the enthusiasm which they have come back to Nepal, and put it to productive use. And that's what's going to build resilience and hopefully build back better.
In fact, I think, my personal opinion is like Nepal is a bit of a litmus test for all this. So let's see what happens. Well, Kunda, Aziz, thank you very much again for sparing your time for us today, and all the best out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks. In 2021, the World Bank estimates that remittances to low and middle income countries will recover by about 5.6% to $470 billion. But the outlook remains uncertain. What is certain is the COVID-19 pandemic has a very, very long tail. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.